Welcome to the fourth episode of our series on resilience, innovation, and the Alberta economy. This episode, entitled in short form Recommendations, we'll be looking at what might be done to increase economic resilience and the effectiveness of Alberta's innovation ecosystem. We've been talking about this in some depth through the previous webinars, and I've invited the commentators back today. John Liston, who was with us for the discussion around questions that you might be asking candidates, and seems to be very timely, and that election is now underway, finally. And Trevor Lewington, who was with us during the discussions on regional differences and the effectiveness of the innovation ecosystem, and then Brad Ferguson when we discussed some of the urban differences, but more specifically how the professions differ from one another, and probably more importantly, the role of government, which, if you might recall, varies differently across the various regions of the province. So that's who the three of them are. That's the role that they've played. And I decided to lay out a bit of an agenda that provides some structure to what could otherwise be quite chaotic today. I've just finished with the introductions. You may want to know more, and as they speak, we can certainly probe for a little bit more depth on where the hell did they come up with that idea. We were discussing earlier the historical history of the settling of this province and how it has shaped some of the politics and may shape the expectations around goal of government. Our objectives will be to explore the various concerns that have emerged that may be impeding economic diversification, or that could, in fact, if we were only tweak it a little bit, help amplify it and increase the progress, or the same as it relates to our innovation ecosystem. I'll provide a bit of an overview just to get everybody warmed up, and that many of you maybe have not viewed the former episodes that are all posted online. And then we'll get into a discussion of a number of issues that relate to resilience, the innovation ecosystem, the differences between the urban areas and the professions. When John was with us for the first episode, the questions that people posed to the candidate fell into a number of areas, and they only seem to make sense. What was the long-term vision for the province? What are short and long-term objectives for diversification? What's their vision for promoting innovation and supporting the innovation ecosystem? From an educational point of view, what can be done to ensure a workforce is trained and equipped to meet the demands of a rapidly changing job market? In healthcare, what can be done to improve healthcare in Alberta? On management, how will you increase transparency, accountability, and effectiveness in decision-making in the public sector? And then as it relates to the federal government, and this didn't come up extensively, but it was clearly in the mix, how will you mitigate the negative impact of federal policies on Alberta's ability to attract investment and develop resources? So these are the things that, interestingly enough, came up in the webinar as a byproduct of questions asked by those in the KEI network, but they echo very much the sentiment of what's going on out in the hustings today as people make a decision as to who should be governing this province. And recognizing this webinar and what we do is not just about government, but an election is underway. It's not surprising that we would be asking that question and having a discussion around the various viewpoints. So I'm going to start out with you, John. You've had now 2-3 weeks to reflect on what we were doing. You've seen what's going on as it might relate to an election. We're not interested in who's going to win. We're going to see that sooner enough. But have you given further thought to the questions and what we saw a couple of weeks ago? So I'm going to start out with you and let you just sort of wax eloquent, as you're prone to do, about this topic. So unmute and let's go.
Wax eloquent has never been used in a sentence with me, Perry. First of all, congratulations, Perry, on your award with the Rotary Club. We mentioned it before, but I know it was just last week that you received the Integrity Award, and speaks to the contributions you've made in the community. So congratulations, and well deserved. I was speaking to your son about it, so very proud son. You know, the way Perry and I started talking about this was I wrote a piece in a local paper. I live in St. Albert, about orange or blue, and ultimately putting some, trying to put some neutrality to what are the issues instead of who do you dislike the most. And when he saw that, it aligned very much with what Perry was working towards, which was, taking the survey, putting it into Chat GPT, and then summarizing what Chat GPT thought the parties would say. So it's a very interesting process. And as I've told people about it over the last few weeks, many have asked for the document to take a look at all of those things. And it really does, kind of separate all of this, flying your flag, and starts to really challenge people to think about what are the issues that are important versus, I don't like what this person did here, here, and here. So I think it was a very interesting process, Perry. I don't know what more feedback you've received, but ultimately, it came down to many of these categories. Looking for leadership, looking for people, as opposed to tearing each other down, who had a vision for the future, what was it based on, and of course we just can't get away from the fact that there's a world that wants to reduce emissions, and we actually know that we can do that. But there was many of the underlying questions were down that direction. Of course, our dependence on oil and gas. So again, I think we were probably better off to listen to the people attending on what their feedback was post that
You
session.
made a good point there. And if we had that impact, or if people watching what we've been doing pay much attention, one of the recommendations is that we during an election, or maybe even between election, we focus more on policy instead of on these negative attitudes of, do we like the right? Do we want to go left? What do they stand for? Not so much ideology. What is it that they are representing? And I think we tried to get at that by focusing on things like, if we have a province that needs some help in diversification, or regions that need that help, what might be done about it, instead of simply arguing about color like orange and blue. Brad, you want to jump in there? Anything you want to add? Economic diversification was clearly one of the bigger issues along the way, but I'll let you jump in there, Brad.
Well, on the list of topics that I think was kind of related to John's session, everything was the top one was around vision, and I still haven't heard any vision from any leader in any way, shape, or form. What we've done is we've got identity politics, and we've divided the province into micro areas. We've divided communities into micro areas. And as a result, all the platform, or a lot of the narrative has been around single issue and identity type of policies that are all around let's fix a problem, or you're a victim group, for example. And nobody's come together and talked about like an economic strategy, a unifying strategy of what are we trying to become, what do we want to be, and what are our opportunities to compete and win and make this, hands down, the most competitive jurisdiction in North America. Nobody's talking about those languages. I went back and I started thinking through from Getty to Ralph to Stelmach and Redford. I think at Prentice it kind of stopped after that. And no one has asked, nobody's really come up with an economic strategy that unifies since that time. And that's provincially, but it's also missing federally. It's missing municipally. I can only talk for Edmonton, but it's missing municipally too. And I think everybody, all the politicians have diverted to the easy thing, which is let's try to solve problems, throw money at things, and give everyone a label. And what I'd like to do is ideally, see something that is a little bit more unifying. So.
Well, it's clear that the winning and losing, the strategy seems to be one of hate the other party, which is an emotional appeal as opposed to an intellectual or a thinking appeal. Trevor, the session that we had a chat about is things seem to be so complex, it's almost impossible to come up with a policy or position that would satisfy all. You want to elaborate any further on that? Is that am I recollecting correctly the discussions we had?
Well, I think it comes back to what Brad talked about, and that's the fact that there's no compelling vision, right? So people are willing, I think, to accept complexity and complex ideas if they see an end result and if they can see how these puzzle pieces fit together. We've talked about the polarization of politics, and diversification, which is near and dear to my heart as an economic developer, seems to have become a discussion of it's something or something as opposed to and, right? So it's oil and gas or renewables. And my argument is, why can't it be both? We're world leaders in oil and gas extraction and refining and value-added processing of that. Why can't we also be the world's leaders in renewable energies and hydrogen? And although that's happening, Edmonton certainly with their hydrogen hub is leading the way. We don't hear politicians often talking about the and. We still seem to be relying on the or. And I think even that one word change can shift the whole conversation, because, again, people fly the flag, and certainly I have a certain political viewpoint and I tend to think a certain way. But in my part-time job, also as an elected municipal politician, I'm also pretty pragmatic. So even if it's not a philosophical thing I would typically vote for, but it solves a problem, I don't really care what my platform or my quote unquote party would stand for. Again, we have to get back to recognizing that politicians of all stripes are also there to solve problems. And even though, a party may stand for a certain thing, I think we've seen left-leaning governments around the world do very fiscally conservative things. And we've seen very right-leaning governments, invest in very sort of typically socially left-leaning policies. And so sometimes the party is an interesting sort of advertisement. It's interesting once every 4 years. And certainly that colors the discussion. But governments of both sides tend to gravitate to what needs to happen and what's the right answer, regardless of what their philosophical leanings are. And I think, again, we get caught up in the emotion, as you said, of the election cycle. But once that all quiets down, we all go back to work and hopefully can focus on the real issues.
Well, I think the webinars that we did on decarbonization were focused on whether you believe the sky is falling or the sky is failing. I mean, one way or another, it's become an emotional argument, appealing to people's emotion, where that series was talking about balancing, recognizing the relevance of a continuing commitment to energy, doing the very best that can be done in order to clean it up, and looking at alternatives and the pathway as not a hiccup, but something we need to gradually pursue. I know, Brad, when you were in economic development, you were in Edmonton, you were clearly a champion of recognizing we could diversify off oil and gas, but we could still continue to amplify the relevance of oil and gas on our industry. Any color you want to add there? I mean, there's a recommendation embedded in here.
I mean, I really was, I tried to focus on broadening the energy mix, and in our traditional energy sources, they would become cleaner, greener, safer, faster, cheaper. We'd always used to say, but then the opportunity to build a renewable industry on top of it. I mean, you're really getting the best of both that way. And if we do it smartly, there's an opportunity to expand overall energy production of BTUs coming out of Alberta, regardless of which source that is, while significantly reducing emissions based on our geological structures that are available and the technology that we can put in place. And so again, going back to Trevor's and versus or, I was just a huge proponent of the and I think Trevor was right by, we were side by side on that, north and south.
So the positions that we're taking on virtually every issue to this moment require some element of thinking. We're putting information on the table that needs to be thought through, and we're not asking people to panic and reflexively fall into some emotional camp that is panicky, which young people tend to be prone and more likely to respond emotionally, in that they don't have as much experience on whether or not nukes are going to get released or not. Let's move on, though. As we've talked about oil and gas being a key element of diversification, we've clearly seen in southern Alberta considerable progress in diversification, even in a short period as much as 5 years. I've seen that in the data. I've heard that through visits. Trevor, what has been going on? If you were to make any recommendation to other regions as to what you're doing in Southern Alberta, or maybe reflecting on manufacturing in Central and some of the things going in the North. What about rural Alberta and opportunities for economic diversification?
Yeah, I think it's economic development 101. It's play to your strengths. So agriculture has historically been the mainstay of Southern Alberta. And I think we've been very focused over the last 5 years about value-added processing. How do we shift primary agriculture to value-added processing and agri-food? And we've seen an enormous amount of investment from companies looking at this region. These are global players. And we've seen the results. I mean, double-digit growth in exports in each of the last 4 years. That's not insignificant for this region, and that's local data. And the vast majority of that is manufactured goods as opposed to raw commodities. That it's actually manufacturing, whether it's durable goods or food products, that's driving that growth. So, that's not rocket science. There was no magic wand, but it's like, hey, we're really good at primary production. How about we just do other things with that here instead of shipping it away to foreign countries that add value and then buy it back from them? And that's a result of government investment. There's been a number of federal and provincial programs people have been able to leverage here. It's a result of, as you mentioned earlier, the innovation ecosystem, our post-secondaries, engaging and delivering programming that's linked to the needs of industry. And, so both our college and university are very, very focused on agri-food and agriculture and understanding where they play and how they can support the value chain. And I think, it's, again, zeroing in on where you have strength and where you can leverage those. And so tech, for example, we will never compete with the medical tech hub that's in Edmonton. We will likely never compete with the fintech hub that's growing in Calgary. Our strength, if it's in ag, okay, well, ag tech, it's geospatial technologies, it's, crop management, it's irrigation control systems. That, again, we can move into tech, we can leverage the tech sector. That can be a strong point for Southern Alberta's economy, but we'll likely keep it focused on the things that we're really good at.
So when you say playing to your strength, I mean, that's really an important point. And I think Brad was emphasizing that as well. But are we playing to the strength? Well, we are playing to the strength based on a recognition that we have regional differences. Playing to the strength in Central Alberta, playing to the strength in Northern Alberta. So economic development, and I think this was one of the conclusions of the webinar that you and I were participating in, is regional development is really the focus. And with good regional development focused on their strengths, you get provincial diversification. So diversification doesn't mean we're homogeneous. In fact, it means very much the opposite. And we may have regional differences, which we're seeing in the survey. It's not necessarily a bad thing. That becomes actually a strength. I don't know whether you want to jump in there at all, Brad, but we're talking about diversification and recognizing that these regional differences, Edmonton may help us through times when one other region is suffering. And the fact that it's got a heavy public sector profile isn't necessarily for the province's diversification as a whole a negative.
Yeah, I mean, we're a huge country, first of all. So right across the nation, when the Canadian dollar or a petrodollar goes up, Ontario hurts. They need Alberta. When it goes down, the other way happens. We're perfectly diversified across the country in that regard. So you take it down to a provincial level, it makes a lot of sense to think of it that way. I mean, we get focused on diversification as to, I think most of the 1990s, early 2000s was what's the next big thing, as opposed to diversification, like Trevor was talking about, across the value chain, diversification by your export markets, lots of different elements of diversification that aren't necessarily just around what's the next technology or how do we, grow new sectors. You can diversify within things that are never going to go away. Our economy is, energy, transportation, food, fiber, health. Those things are all going to be the industries of the future. And yes, so it's around how do we, continue to strengthen our positions in that. I mean, we've got so much going well for Alberta on a long-term trend point of view. I'm not actually too interested personally in terms of diversifying into a whole lot of new sectors. The sectors we have will continue to feed us for multiple generations as long as we know how to be competitive. We keep a small, smart, stable government with low tax structure. We encourage entrepreneurism, and that continues to feed the machine over a long-term period of time.
John, you want to
I want to vote for
Good
Brad
challenge.
wherever Brad's going to run. I want to vote. Very interesting. I got involved with a group called Startup TNT. Zach Storms and a group of others who were raising capital for startup of every sort. One of the companies that was pitching, and I invested some money into this group, was a group out of Seattle who were taking hemp seed and squeezing the oil out of the hemp seed. Well, the best place in the world to grow hemp is down in southern Alberta. It can have 2 cycles and all sorts of different things. And so capital was being brought out of Edmonton. So we're trying to get a lot of the successful business people to invest their money into the future with the startup companies. The startup company, this one was out of Seattle, and they were part of a pitch group, and the production was happening. So you could see the connection here. It may be that Edmonton plays a big role, or Calgary, in not in our region, but providing the capital for the other regions to develop. So it's going to be a very interesting success story. These guys are developing this resin that can be used in almost in place of fiberglass. Very interesting stuff. So I do think that we've got a lot of good synergy going on right now. Again, if we can kind of forget regionalization, say who can do what best, and maximize it. And Trevor's example last 2 weeks ago of a medical company, and it was best served to be in Edmonton, or fintech in Calgary. When we get 1 + 1 = 3, according to Covey, if we do this thing properly. If we get caught in this win-lose, is 1 + 1 = 1.5. And I'm hoping we get the visionary leadership to get to 3 instead of 1.5.
I'd like to pick up on 2 points you've made there. One is the relevance of vision, which we cited earlier, but also the availability of capital, which is part of the innovation ecosystem, which in the survey showed that we seem to be fairly strong in resources like financing, although most are recognizing it's still inadequate, particularly at the angel and early stage and sustainable level. But we've made progress. And infrastructure, whether it be the availability of incubators or the internet and access to fiber and the movement of data. But the weakness was in vision and leadership, and in the decision making, which in short form is management. Hold on, that's a weekly affair. So you picked up on the grassroots. The fact that TNT was initiated by someone who in a region saw an opportunity, capitalized on it, brought people together for financing. Calgary is an astounding story over the last few years, where when oil and gas hit bottom, the executives came to the table and said, we've got to do more in this region besides just relying on oil and gas, and took financing and brought capital to the table, which helped immensely innovation in Calgary and recognizing the opportunities in other regions. So in both instances, we saw individuals, whether they were executive leaders or simply someone who sold beer, say there's opportunities here for inspiring Albertans to become players in that innovation ecosystem, so essential for diversification. Brad or Trevor, you want to relate? I know Southern Alberta in the most recent survey did indicate that it really needed more help in technology commercialization. So financing was identified as an issue, and maybe the availability of incubators in other regions. Anyone want to add any color to that?
My only color is, when we talk about the capital markets, Alberta is a small player in the global capital market world. Our image and reputation that we put out there is personified by the leader we choose. The people we put forward, are characterized in other jurisdictions, in Toronto, Montreal, New York, Chicago, as a little on the crazy side. And that's for everyone. Like, that's the leaders that we put out there. And we could look at them both ways. But the conversations I have is like people read whatever appears in the local news or a national news, and our best foot forward they're not necessarily the best marketers for the province to attract capital. Jason Kenney was phenomenal at it. I had a chance to attend with him going around to the 5 big CEOs of the banks, about 5 big banks rather, and I watched him and be the defender of the province and the promoter of the province. And this isn't a partisan comment, but he was excellent at it. He should, unfortunately, with COVID, he never got a chance to be out on the road. I judge a lot of our leaders by how they operate on the road. That's an external facing CEO role, as opposed to internal COO role. And when I'll tell you that it's an important part of Alberta's brand is to get out there and be promoting and change it, because we're fighting gravity in terms of what the world perceives of us right now. And in order to expand that capital market that we have in Calgary for small or high tech or early stage, late stage, whatever, we need to put a significant stamp on our image and reputation.
This is a very interesting point on leadership. There are leaderships that inspire others, and there are leaders that say government should and can do it for you. There are 2 fundamental differences in an approach to leadership, one which is the doer and the other one which is the inspirer. You mentioned Kenny going out into the world at large and helping them appreciate the Alberta advantage as a stable place to invest with great opportunity, and someone else maybe with a different viewpoint saying, we as government can do it for you. That difference does in fact reflect some of the differences between 2 parties as we have them vying for an election now. John, I'm not asking you to raise your right or your left hand, but we're clearly talking about different leadership styles and different leadership objectives.
Well, and it's a great point by Brad in that what is the role of government? What is the role of the premier? And if we don't even have a job description, then whoever we put in there takes on the persona that they choose to. When Jason Kenney got in and he brought in David Knight-Legg to build Invest Alberta, they were getting in front of some people that hadn't had someone in front of them for 20 years, and yet they were investing huge amounts into Alberta. And then what we did is we took the media and attacked David Knight-Legg because he stayed in an expensive hotel in London. But we did an extraordinary job during COVID of getting out there. And like Brad said, my opinion is we need leadership that attracts. And I grew up with a Carney family. Mark Carney's younger brother, one of my closest friends, and Mark would say, like, "What are you guys doing?" Now I'm not endorsing Mark. Who knows where that's going to go? But we do have to pay attention to that vision piece and what we look like from the outside in. Listen to what the BBC is saying about us, not so much what our local papers are.
So we've got the vision on one side of leadership that is inspiring, probably more developmental. The other one saying, look, you're dependent, you need government, we can do it for you until such time as you can carry on your own. And then you've got the middle ground, which is partnering, which says the right model may be one where we do a little bit of both. Hydrogen may be an example. EV, although we've gotten excessive, I think, in Ontario. But that partnering option, Trevor, when you look at municipal politics today, as opposed to regional or provincial, are municipalities involved in the economic development process, or is this something so complex it needs to be at arm's length?
No, I mean, I think most municipalities have an economic development function, even if it's off the side of someone's desk and combined with permitting and other responsibilities. I mean, Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge all have external agencies that do economic development, whereas at Wood Buffalo, Fort McMurray, in the same token. So, there's various ways of organizing and structuring, but I think if you're a municipality, if you're a municipal council, and you're not thinking about your economy, you're not thinking about your role in economic development, that's a huge miss. Municipalities control a lot of aspects that can kill an investment deal, whether it's zoning, permitting, just the red tape and complexity. It's very easy for a deal. I've had many examples where at the last minute, it's an irksome municipal consideration that tanks a deal that's been worked on for many months. And even if there's large incentives from other levels of government, It's often those finer details and long-term operating costs from things like municipal taxes that make a big difference in the final calculation. So yeah, municipalities absolutely need to be at the table, and they need to have a keen eye or they're going to miss out.
The municipalities are very close to the voter. And if the voter doesn't think economics or industrial policy or the relevance of taxes in that region coming, or that community coming from some forms of business, they get caught up on identity politics issues and social sensitivities and name changing, and completely overlook that the land developer, the landowner, is going to be the one that drives that economy. And what they do is they build more bedroom communities. How do you get municipalities to recognize that the economies are their future? If there is no tax base, the future is going to be sensitive. We've seen that in St. Albert, John.
Yes.
A very popular community, but really no economic foundation to enable taxation. And now the municipality, very late in the game, is beginning to recognize that the vulnerability of that community and its longevity or sustainability based on residential tax bases is going to make it a gated community someday. Brad, do you see any problems of that nature as you look at the province as a whole? And that is this imbalance between, building a nice place to live and recognizing that without an economy, it's questionable whether it's sustainable.
Yeah, I remember my first day, literally my first day as the CEO of Edmonton Economic Development. We met with the city and they had an economic development group. And I was trying to figure out, what lines are drawn where. And I remember getting up on the whiteboard and I said, if we were all one company, like if we're all one organization, all we have is plots of land. And the question is, what do we do on those plots of land? And you put in servicing and curbs and whatever, and you get them ready as inventory, and they sit in inventory until a potential buyer comes along or someone that wants to develop it. And then we have a choice that can either be done in a green space or it could have a smokestack, let's just say. And that's a political decision as to what that happens. But eventually, whatever happens on those plots of land need to generate employment and taxes, and and a great place to live. We kind of simplified it down to that base level of all you have is raw materials. They go into production. What we produce determines the quality of life that comes in, and that determines the economic structure. And it made sense to me. It lasted a long time. We always used to talk about what was above the line, below the line, what was the city to do, and what was the economic development agency there to do. And I think but that base level of education, like Perry, what you're talking about, should really start back in the school system.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what drives an economy. What is a too high of a tax structure such that it all collapses? How do you do trade-offs in terms of what do you do on a piece of land, and how should options be evaluated? Those are all things that if we taught in a school system, we'd have a population that would engage in a deeper and richer conversation around what's important from choosing whether it be a local councillor or a provincial leader.
Well, that's a good transition into education as a topic. We saw as an overview, the issue of Alberta's workforce needs to be trained and equipped to meet the demands of a rapidly changing job market. I mean, we bring in technologies, whether they be emerging technologies in extraction, emerging technologies in healthcare, or what we're now seeing in information management with this tsunami of issues that relate to knowledge management and generative AI. But education is clearly playing a role in our future, and also playing a role in whether or not our counselors are well enough educated in order to govern in a rapidly changing environment. An interview or a discussion I had a few weeks ago with the dean of business at NAIT really caught me off guard. I was thrilled to hear that the educational system seems to be recognizing that, at least in the technical institute, they need to get a little bit closer to what's relevant to the workforce. And what seems to be relevant to the workforce from his perspective, as we talk about managers in the workforce, is managers not necessarily coming out skilled in a particular industry, but recognizing they're going to have to be change agents, not just for themselves, for their own welfare, but for the companies that they work with, organizations themselves have to become change-minded instead of wedded to a single technology or a single profit line. Trevor, when you look at agriculture in southern Alberta pivoting as a byproduct of a number of things, do you see change management as being relevant to the educational system?
No, I think, to use the phrase, the only constant is change, and that's only going to accelerate from here. Industries are being disrupted. We know that, technologies are having an impact, and it's more the impact that it has on the workforce. To your point, it's not about just providing the right skills, but how do you transition people from skills? So, I think Calgary's Edge Up program did a masterful job of helping people in traditional oil and gas roles transition to the film and entertainment industry. That's a really interesting example of taking, really non-comparable sectors and creating a bridge to create a workforce where there was an identified need. How do we do more of that and link, transitions in industries? For example, the Conference Board of Canada last year, I think, did a survey on vulnerability of communities to automation. And Lethbridge was among the top 5 in Canada in terms of vulnerability. Many of the jobs here are either farm labor, field labor, entry-level manufacturing labor. Those jobs are going to disappear. They will be entirely displaced by automation in the foreseeable future. So where do those people go? They don't necessarily today have the skills they need to do the next level of job that's about troubleshooting and reading operator interfaces and understanding control systems. So there's an enormous gap to take that workforce we know will be displaced and get them ready for the next opportunity. So that's a clear gap. And I do see institutions, it's career training companies, it's career development companies, it's companies themselves. You have an internal responsibility to transition your own workforce, in my mind. But the post-secondaries here, perhaps because it's a smaller market, are a little bit better connected to industry. I do see a lot of industry advisory committees, a lot of applied research, which is, industry driven in both institutions. And I think that's only going to become more and more critical as we move forward.
The word vulnerability is very interesting because we've seen a certain level of confidence in the Calgary market, which is reliant on industry, and industry is reliant on market forces. But the Edmonton market, more public sector driven, and the professions that rely heavily on how that public sector works, may be more vulnerable because they rely heavily on a government regulation that says you've got exclusive rights of practice in healthcare and medicine and engineering, et cetera. If government starts to get nervous about the emergence of generative AI, for example, or markets becoming frustrated with waiting lists and waiting, government begins to release those regulations, expecting more innovation in those sectors. And those professions begin to become vulnerable, in which case Edmonton may be one of the more vulnerable markets as waiting lists grow, as people become frustrated that simply growing more capacity may not be the answer. Brad, you know that market well. We've talked about the reliance of Edmonton as an economy on the health and welfare of health, education, and good government. Is Edmonton more vulnerable, or is it already beginning to adapt and recognizing that technologies and market forces may come to bear on what have relied heavily on nation building through professions?
Any city that has a strong industrial base tends to, and that has survived, for multi-decades, tends to have an element of innovation and urgency in it. And cities that are much more public sector driven, whether that be the public service, healthcare, education, et cetera, honestly haven't had that sense of urgency for change. So they haven't had that burning platform where they need to come up with something new by next week, otherwise there's consequences. If they don't come up with something new by next week, the line just gets longer in healthcare, it can be just slower in terms of the delivery of service, for example. But so I think, as the structure of the local economy is less urgent, less innovative in the Edmonton community because it's had a nice safety net and probably 20% of the industry or in the employment structures that hasn't been driven by urgency, constant change, and all those things. that have driven a lot of our industrial base. So, that would be my first comment on it. Yeah, I'll just leave it at there that way. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think we've seen in other webinars, and it's been repeated. I think we've seen it in the series as well, that the professions are beginning to recognize the importance of what we call relational skills. That as the market becomes more sophisticated, particularly in healthcare, and begins to shop around, begins to have knowledge itself as clients come consumers, the professions themselves have already begun to shift from simply being, knowledge carriers to recognize the importance of the relationship that they have with this new consumer. That constitutes a change and an adaptation and an adjustment that may serve them well, because as they become more aware that the client's becoming a consumer, then they become more adaptive and more innovative. And we're going to study that further when we do a series on healthcare reform in the coming years, not driven by government or by throwing more money at it, but by recognizing that the market that healthcare is serving is in fact itself changing, and technology is aiding it. I'd like to shift now to healthcare then. I don't know whether any one of the three of you have had a particular interest in healthcare. It certainly is, well, maybe number one in among many voters, with one of the primary issues being waiting lists. A judge in BC says waiting lists are not healthcare. Are there changes underway, and are there any recommendations in this area that may relate to our economy? Is healthcare really have any relationship to the economy, or is it just a matter of making sure people are well? I mean, we've got an aging workforce that has some bearing on healthcare. Anybody want to jump in as to how healthcare relates to all of this? It came up frequently in the surveys.
I'll jump in, Perry. I was on the board of Caritas Health Group back in the 90s when Ralph Klein made some changes, and I came in on the board slightly after that, which was quite an exciting time in trying to reset healthcare. We've never been economically sound in healthcare. We in the 50s, we had the Grey Nuns running the General Hospital in Edmonton. We had free labor. And so we've never been able to figure out the economics of it. Mazankowski wrote a report in the 90s that basically said it's all about incentives and the rest is rhetoric. We just don't have the incentives aligned properly in the healthcare system, and so we have to. My best example is Dynalife. Dynalife is a privately held company that's providing support to a public system. So we have a public system. It just happens to get some of its supplies from a privately held company that has accountability. And back to, Brad's comment earlier, never give a job to someone who won't feel the pain for getting it wrong. And that's the danger of government, right? Is there's no real consequence there if you get it wrong. You just, like you say, have longer wait lines at the emergency room. So we have to get some accountability into the system. And I don't know if that's done through privatization. I'm a big fan of that. So I'm playing my cards there a little bit. But we have to find a way to create incentives in the system so that people are drawn to want to get it right and feel the pain of getting it wrong. And right now, I don't know if you saw it today, but a letter came out today from 190 emergency room doctors saying, we're in complete disarray. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Alberta can't attract primary care doctors. So we have a system that we continually try to Band-Aid fix, and then we complain that the Band-Aid keeps coming off. I think we have to get it again back to a vision. Danielle's vision is to try to separate the funder from the provider. So breaking AHS into two pieces. That's what her thinking is.
Putting a name to it, I mean, I think what the argument that's been presented by many is that when monopolies transition, you inject competition. And competition is not privatization. Competition is personalization, giving individuals the opportunity to make a choice. And with that making a choice, they become more informed. They shop around, they create market forces where they didn't exist in the existence of a monopoly, and it was dominated by government. So one of the things that comes up in the next section on management is balancing supply and demand in what was formerly a monopoly that was administered, not managed. So one of the transitions which has been talked about through all of these webinars is the introduction of transparency, accountability, and effectiveness, typically through the introduction of competition, which is what an economy is based on, not public sector monopolies, but recognizing that there are opportunities for competition, even in healthcare and education, for which people get very nervous in this country anytime you talk about personalization or making decisions in what is our great Canadian public sector monopoly. There's change underway because markets are changing, which means individuals are changing and decisions have to be made on a more routine basis at a management level.
We've got like in our consulting firm, our healthcare practice is our second largest practice, and growing probably faster than any other practice right now. But most of the work is being done in Ontario, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, where those provinces are trying to innovate. So the projects we're doing are all around, how do we come up with more private delivery models within a publicly funded system, which is what we have in Alberta. We just don't call it that. We're scared from, talking about it like that. And a lot of what we're working on are how do we create competition within those, jurisdictions. We used to have it in Alberta where we had multiple health authorities. And in those multiple health authorities, each health authority had to be benchmarked against each other. So whether it be wait times, whether it be speed of delivery of something, cost, et cetera. When we consolidated the health system, we got rid of competition inside the province amongst the health authorities. And as a result, there is no benchmarking against each other. And a lot of Albertans don't know how bad they have it in terms of access to doctors, speed to getting through wait lines, access to different types of equipment, et cetera, until you expose it and create competition and transparency, what you talk about, Perry. Yeah, it's pretty tough to get excellence. You need competition to have excellence.
One of the criticisms of introducing competition is people see waste. They say, oh, well, if they didn't get it right, they're wasting money. Whereas if you leave it all with a central decision maker, they'll make sure we don't have waste. Well, it seems to me that anytime government spends money, it doesn't worry about waste. It's simply moving money around to create jobs. And they'll always rationalize, well, the money was always spent and it was spent in the interest of creating jobs. Whether those jobs are effective or not, hell, we dig a hole, we fill a hole, we keep people employed. Effectiveness doesn't seem to be top of mind when it comes to public sector service delivery.
It's not malice. It's not an intent in any way by the government to do that. It's just that systemically, it doesn't work. So back to Brad's comment earlier about smaller government, right? We just need less of this expansion. Again, Fraser Institute put out a report, 2014 to 2018, there were 78,000 new jobs in the public sector, and 46,000 lost in the private sector. And obviously the economy played a big role in that, but I'm not sure what the economy did to produce 78,000 more jobs. I don't know where those people went and what they did. So we could be much more efficient and effective. It's interesting in the chat, Yogi is asking, I'm a big fan of Yogi's. He's asking, couldn't we turn this thing into a more productive profit center, right? There's huge economic development in healthcare if we were to do this thing properly, as opposed to being on the defense and always apologizing. We could turn this thing into a huge business and meet everybody's needs. And so being a capitalist, I'd love to see that, as opposed to us always apologizing and always in negotiations and spending our time on defense instead of offense.
Let me put a historical perspective on this, though. We've been building a health and education system that is oriented on supply. We needed to supply a country with good healthcare and good education, but at some point in time, one's got to recognize that the system's been built. It's now time to get reoriented away from supply onto why the systems were built in the first place, which was to serve people. So the word effective is not about supply. The word effective is whether or not we're actually rendering a service of value to the people who are the recipients. Whereas most of the dialogue we have today in Canada at a political level is about supply. We need more capacity. It's never ending.
Yeah,
And that sounds like an ideology, but I'm simply talking about bringing management forces to bear. Once you have historically recognized we have built systems, now it's time to make them effective.
we could spend 100% of our provincial budget on healthcare and still have a monstrous demand. So
Well, I don't think I want you as a politician, John. No,
but that's the challenge. So we have to, you define yourself by what you're prepared to say no to, and we have to learn how to say no to the right things and yes to the right things and no to the wrong things.
Well, I mean, the word personalization is really cute. It's got a lot of political potential. Is recognizing that you as an individual in a waiting for hip surgery, it's not acceptable anymore. This is not about doctors. This is about you in pain. And it's time we recognize the need for a system that gets you off that waiting list as soon as possible. And the same in education, that we are training you and you are getting trained to be confident as you go to the job market, that your skills will be everlasting and sustainable. And I'm hearing that. I heard that from Nate the other day, which was thrilling. In fact, I think I bought him the drink. If our education system is waking up to the fact that change is underway, continuous learning is fundamental, and you are going to have to adapt, and that's good news. Continuous learning is in fact going to keep you vital for a life and keep you employed. Trevor, you want to jump in there?
I'll come back to your original question about what's the impact of healthcare on the economy. It's an enormous government expense, right? It's the single largest department. It consumes an enormous quantity of our tax dollars. So there's no question we have to have that conversation, but it needs to be an intelligent conversation around the healthcare sector and its contribution as well. So AHS itself is the single largest employer in my community by a wide margin as a regional service center. And that doesn't include all of the private practices and all of the other healthcare adjacent services that are provided by private clinics and things outside of AHS itself. So the impact is significant. I think we have to think through that. It's rightly been identified in the chat that AI and some of the technologies that are coming down the pike are going to vastly change diagnosis, treatment, data gathering, data-driven healthcare. I guess my only perspective would be, a cautionary one. So, there has to be balance. And so I've experienced the US system. My son was injured in a snowmobile accident in the US. He required a number of surgeries over a short period of time. And at the end of 1 week, my bill was $900,000. Right? Healthcare, unexpected incidents like that do happen are the #1 cause of bankruptcy in the US. And it drives almost 70% of bankruptcies in people that are 50 or older. That's not acceptable to me either. It's touted as a very efficient system, but there's a number of benchmarks that would say, although the technology is often worse in Canada and the treatments are often not as cutting edge, that the per capita cost of Canadian healthcare at scale, when compared to the US private system, it's actually cheaper in Canada, right? So I agree there's other methodologies. I agree we have to look at how we can create private equity and private sector opportunities. But I firmly believe this is an and conversation once more, that it's not the US system, it's not the Canadian system. There is a middle ground, and it's leveraging the best of those two worlds. Because if it wasn't for my employer, at the time, a large multinational company that had significant clout with the insurer, I would have been out almost $1 million for what was a one-off sort of incident, right? So I think, again, we have to be very mindful that there's every one of those statistics, at the end of every one of those dollars is a human, and the healthcare system is designed to deliver a service that you can't always attach a finite return on investment to. And so I think we have to be a bit mindful of that.
Well, I mean, the US focus is very much on insurers, on how to make sure that people are not hit with a $900,000 bill. And so the focus is not so much on the 900,000, but on how do we build an insurance system adequate to cover those costs. So the US focuses on a different issue. What Canada seems to be focused on in healthcare is beginning the transition. How do we begin to do the reform instead of maintenance of the status quo and fighting all the time where the change is called for, as opposed to just building more capacity. And I'm seeing, you mentioned surgeons. In Edmonton, there has been a breakout. A number of surgeons, out of frustration, have gone out and set up their own clinic in order to reduce the wait times for hip surgery and knee surgery. We've seen that in eye surgery worked perfectly well. So maybe the changes that we're expecting are going to come in that relationship between the client and the supplier, not through some new government ideological transition. Okay, now turning to federal government for a moment. The federal government has in healthcare, for example, and in other areas, intervened in provincial affairs by recognizing that some changes are called for and getting into negotiations around budgets and making some strings attached, which they're not supposed to. But it's apparent that even at the federal level, there's a recognition of some needs for change and to hold the provinces accountable to make some adjustments that will bring about change. Now we've got police forces being reviewed, we've got healthcare being reviewed, we've got the role of government again as a big issue. There has been a negative impact on Alberta in the healthcare industry, and a recognition that there's some federal objectives that don't align well with provincial objectives. How do we manage that federal relationship? Okay, well, we are seeing in Ontario some experiments going on, and we've seen
I mean, it's interesting, you know, I live with 1 foot in each province, and I love that. But you know, it's interesting. You get your OHIP card in Ontario, and you immediately log online, and you have your entire health record in front of you. You've got everything written by every physician at your fingertips, and you own it. And to give ownership of your health record, you know, and you walk around with it, it's an empowering part of being and control over your own health, your own body, everything like that. So it starts with that in my mind. Ontario is just on a tear to innovate within the healthcare system right now. So you've got, you know, the Federal Health Act is written in one form, but it's interpreted differently by provincial ministers and provincial governments, and those change. So you've got the same act that's being interpreted 2 different ways. Ontario is hell-bent on innovating as fast as possible. You've got others that are, you know, putting up barriers to it, would like to go forward, but you know, maybe need a mandate to do that. And then you have others that want the status quo. So, you know, the Federal Health Act is interpreted, you know, differently between different provinces. So it really, I wouldn't get into the federal side of it so much as it's going to come down to provincial leadership.
Clearly, and we have different views of what role and how effective each province may well be in helping to bring about change, and whether there's an alignment of the East and the West and Ontario in terms of changing the nature of that federal provincial relationship. Alberta seems to, whether it would be in the Lougheed days, the Klein days, or whoever is coming, a willingness of Alberta to stand up and make its needs known in a country that doesn't seem to respect at times the role that Alberta is playing as a provider or a supplier to the income of the country, and its future as a source of wealth for the country.
Well, I think we have to, you know, Albertans and Alberta period has to, you know, understand how it's showing up in Ottawa as well. So if it shows up as the petulant child, you know, kicking and screaming on every topic, you know, you arrive at the Fed Prov discussion, you're at the children's table, and then you realize that the adults have been there for the last week and they've actually, you know, resolved most things. And by the time Alberta shows up, you know, kicking and screaming, you know, they're actually not even in the conversation. And I've seen that in a number of activities where a lot of those discussions are, you know, we're very late to the table, and it's our own doing. And that's, you know, there's a couple people in the audience today I'd love to hear from on that, maybe when we get into the Q&A, but I mean, it's the way we're showing up isn't helping our situation.
Well, I think, I mean, once again, we talk about the role and the style of leadership, one being childlike, which shouts and screams about what they want, and children, on the other hand, who are the more dependent. Edmonton has a dilemma. It may act like a child, but in fact, it views itself as having the capability to be very independent. So you've got a confusion between those that appear childlike in crying and screaming for help, or not help, but to want to be even more independent. That's almost the behavior of an adolescent, being a little bit cantankerous about what they want, but not yet ready to accept the fact that they're expected to be independent. How do we become independent? And that brings in the word sovereignty. And I'll stop right there. Okay, let's bring the audience to the table.
Oh God, there's so much has gone on here, and I'm really appreciative of Brad's perspective on our province, because we get so many emotional views of the place. And on the health sector, I shared an office at the Advanced Technology Center with Mahadi Sayed. And some of you will know of his story. It's rather sad in that I saw this guy with this most fantastic software for the health system here in Alberta. And that health system was in real difficulties at the time. And Mahadi came up with a very sophisticated system for the health service. And I was his neighbor. My office was neighboring. So I got the blow-by-blow stuff that was going on. And it's a horror story. If you wanted to document how we have failed entrepreneurs in Alberta, you just have to sort of and I'm a documentary producer too. It would be to document somebody like Mahadi and what he had to go through. And he had actually got some hospitals back east interested in his system and using his system, but it wasn't any, it comes down to, with this big organization, always go to IBM or always trust IBM, or, if you're a top manager, you don't want to really chance anything.
So how to break this mentality of maintaining the status quo? That's one of the big issues.
And it ties in with what Brad was saying about entrepreneurship. I've been an entrepreneur for 20 years, and it's hard. And I've had young people working with me, and they think, oh God, he's struggling to pay the salary this week. What do we do? Is this job going to be here next week for me, and stuff like that? Because you're in a small organization. I had 7 staff at one point. You can see the possibilities of going under at any one point, and somehow we survive. But it's not really realized, I don't think, in the general public. And we do need more realistic education about entrepreneurship, I think.
I think we've seen over and again, the survey continued to reveal it, that SMEs are sort of the heart and soul of innovation, but they take it on the chin. There's total transparency and 100% accountability. Brad, did you want to make a comment?
They have just a quick one, Perry. 80% of new businesses fail. And that's the reality of small business, and so it's hard, it's really hard to go up against that. Anyway, Brad, I'd be interested in your comments.
Well, no, I appreciate your story, your history, and not only you, but the neighbor at the ATC as well. The entrepreneurs have been romanticized, many times, and certainly a ton of our innovation and progress as society is should be attributed to the works of entrepreneurs and business, as opposed to government, because we've come a long way. But boy, it's getting tough. And you think of those in the restaurant industry that have survived over the last 5 years. I just don't know how anybody's still in that industry right now.
No,
you have a changing policy environments. You've got changing rules. You've got massive escalation of cost structures very quickly. Thinking about change management, the ability for our entrepreneurs to anticipate, react, and finance the changes that have been thrust upon them. It's been incredibly hard. And as a result, I think we're going to go through a lost generation where entrepreneur will be a very sought after quest coming out of school. So, and I say that because, and with such disappointment, and I'd love to come back and be proven wrong. I've never been so committed to the fact that I think this is our reality for the next little while.
No, we talked about the force and source of change that are shaking the economy. They differ, but that dynamic at the business level is amplified even more. And the pressure of a changing economy on government and the pressure of the changing economy or changing business structure of an individual is massive. And you see, the loss of investment, the loss of jobs, the loss of confidence. But change clearly has winners. And you're never going to turn off, hopefully you're never going to turn off innovation that is the fuel of the SMA. Any other, Barry, do we blame you for the mess that government's gotten us into over the years in economic development, or can you talk yourself off the hook?
You can blame me if you want. It's well, all I can say is I was doing the best I could with what I had at the time and still do. But I really am, I'm an optimist by heart. And I think that the opportunities that are out there for us, by doing just some of the things we do, we do well, by focusing on some of the things that are working, that people are not really, Canadians are not aware of. For instance, and I've raised it often, the irrigation districts in southern Alberta. And I hear criticism out of Nova Scotia that our farmland is being owned by people who are not farmers. And that's perfect for what we need in the future if we take proper advantage of it by using a model like how the irrigation districts are managed. So yeah, I'm optimistic, but it's maybe that the time horizon is maybe another 10 years or 15 years. And my birth certificate doesn't fit that kind of time horizon. Anyway, if we continue on the road we're on, though, as I said at the last, and I say I'm now out on the street saying it, we're in a race to become an underdeveloped country, full stop. So, I have the optimism that that's what it takes to turn Canadians to something that's positive and innovative.
Well, look, the question there is, if we take that scenario and play the game of, okay, are we headed into a slide? Is the reversal going to come because we've got more entrepreneurial initiative and Canadians as individuals step to the table, step to the plate and hit a few home runs and build the economy from bottom up? Or is this country going to fail because of its over-reliance on government as its father, as its daddy? Barry, you want to finish that one?
As I say, I'm an optimist. I think that we have to get more desperate than we are right now. And Brad, you mentioned that last week, that the message hasn't got through in Southern Ontario. And if the message doesn't get through in Southern Ontario, it's hard to move the Canadian ship.
But someone has just come forward and said, we'll put $17 billion in for Volkswagen as a champion of industry that should be credited with helping to save the country from failing.
Well, that's been the Canadian way in the past too. We're in a learning situation, in my opinion, that we are 38 million people. What percentage of the people of the world is that? And what percentage of the world's land base do we have jurisdiction over? And that battle is not understood. I've heard for a number of years out of, again, Southern Ontario, Brad, that Bay Street is really not interested in anything north of North Bay in Ontario and set the rest of it loose and go our own way. Well, that would be the best thing that could happen to Alberta, in my opinion.
Mhm.
It's a watershed, I guess, is what I'm saying. And we've got 2 ways to go. And hopefully it won't be in 10 to 15 years.
Well, the assets we'd like to play to is that individual initiative emerges and people recognize that change is underway and they want to be part of the transition, as opposed to being victims of a deteriorating situation. I had a boss, she was a deputy minister, who had enormous trust that individuals will react in the face of pressure, and that the confidence and the faith should be placed at the capacity of individual Canadians, individual Albertans, individuals in your region, Trevor, who in fact will lift us. Oh, come on, Peter, share with us your question and perspective. Where are you? There you are.
All right, thank you, Perry, and thank you, Trevor, for pointing out my hand up. And Brad, I also wanted to share with you, I'm actually between Quebec and Ontario. So right now I'm in Quebec, and just across the way is Ontario. And in fact, it's very interesting how the healthcare system in this particular area works, because there are both hospitals on both sides of the border in the communities, but they also often go back and forth, primarily because of specialists. So we can take our children, some of our children were born in Ontario hospitals, even though we lived in this place here. So it's a rather interesting situation because of the 2 cities, or the 2 major communities being along the border. But my point that I wanted to raise was about telehealth and telemedicine. I see these as very transformative things to actually improve healthcare delivery, to improve the shortages that are out there, to shorten healthcare lines. And these are applied to both telehealth, which is primarily the services provided by nurses and nurse practitioners, and telemedicine, which is the kind of services that would be done by surgeons and internists and people who are specialists in various medical care. So I just put those on the table as opportunities, and I think that they have some significant benefits to individuals, to the healthcare system, and actually overall costs in operations. And I also, as well, it's an export opportunity. I mean, export out of Alberta, for example, whether it's to Saskatchewan or to BC, or to some island state in the middle of the Caribbean. It's a great opportunity to diversify and strengthen our medical system, in my view.
This is fascinating.
And I speak with a bit of authority, having done this work. I've been working in telehealth and telemedicine for over 20 years. In fact, over 20 years ago, I was involved in telesurgery between Perth, Australia, and Singapore. And that was done remotely with haptics and high performance computing.
Suppliers look for opportunities in markets. Technology does as well in the hands of suppliers. And you raised a very interesting point that when entrepreneurial initiative may be inadequate, someone seems to come up with a technology that says, I can fix that problem. And we're seeing technology over and over again offering us the promise to solve a problem. Can anyone think of one that's emerged? I mean, Alan, you're certainly aware of fusion as an opportunity to make extraordinary inroads in addressing issues in the long haul that we're facing in climate change and the adequacy and availability of energy. And Jeff and Yogi and Mel and others are certainly seeing the emergence of ChatGPT that says we can't learn or know fast enough. And so ChatGPT emerges to say, look, I can help you answer questions no matter where you are or what they may well be. So we're seeing technology playing a major role in addressing questions of economic diversification at an economic level, at a business level, and at a personal level. Is AI have a role to play in diversification of the innovation ecosystem and addressing the increasing drive for the personalization of our society? Jeff, you want to jump in there? I know this is not a question I asked you to anticipate, but I know you and Mel and Yogi have been not romancing, but asking questions repeatedly about the relevance of generative AI and the economy that we're in today and the one we may be merging into. Do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I guess I would say, Perry, that I think it will have an impact. Where I'm seeing it have its greatest impact right now is in the area of research. I read yesterday about a new antibiotic that was created using AI that is kind of revolutionary in terms of dealing with a very specific type of antibiotic resistant bacteria. I think there's lots of opportunity there. But to your point about innovation, I think, as Barry pointed out, there is innovation happening, but it runs headlong into the brick wall of regulation and privacy and leaders' inability to get past the secure choice. That's usually frustrating. I'm hoping to see something that disrupts, like we talked about this a few weeks back with John's presentation, that we have been with healthcare been picking at the margins. And I think it's been widely recognized as one of the industries that is most ripe for disruption and most in need of disruption because of all of this weight that we've built into the system. And the other thing that was kind of I was reacting to throughout the conversation about healthcare was that we continue to call it a healthcare system when it's very plainly a sick care system. And that if we were to really start to crack that nut, we would start to think differently about it. And we might start to do more, like when we've done in Alberta with allowing pharmacists to prescribe medication. That, I think, is a really or step in the right direction. Having nurse practitioners in rural communities take more responsibility. We also have to crack that nut of physicians being the exclusive gatekeepers to that system, because they are they're a block to some progress as well.
As I said in my posting in the chat, I didn't mention when I was speaking, is the final line is, however, the medical governance model needs tweaking. I was being polite when I said tweaking, of course.
Yeah.
It does need a significant amount of change. And the other thing, of course, is this is something, again, but it's a profession regulated by provinces. So we need a common model as well, I think, in looking at this sort of thing. But I think telehealth, telemedicine will bring that because they are by design borderless.
Yes.
You're not going to have a telehealth system that stands up isolated in Alberta and a telehealth system, telemedicine system stands isolated in Saskatchewan. They're going to be interconnected.
But
So I
someone
think
needs,
this is pretty
someone
positive
needs,
in the long run.
someone needs to kick it off, though, Peter.
Yes, well, this is needs
well,
leadership in both the medical community,
Right.
the entrepreneurial community, and the government.
Yogi, you want to add anything here?
Yes, thank you, Perry. Just to build on what Jeff was saying, in healthcare, or more specifically pharmaceuticals, they're all about the improving the metabolic pathway or reducing problems in the metabolic pathway. And I see a major role in AI for that. And I'll give you two examples. One is the expansion of the mRNA technology that was so successful in the COVID vaccine to a large number of other disease treating situations. And we've seen a whole bunch of research that's going on to use that mRNA technology in those other spaces. The second thing is, when you look in detail at the metabolic pathways, there's a lot of protein folding going on. And that's the key to understanding the biochemistry that's going on. And we've seen DeepMind and others pay some attention to that, because if we understand that better, we can improve the design of molecules that will either improve those metabolic pathways or counteract certain destructions that are the underlying cause of various diseases. So just to build on Jeff's comment about AI and pharmaceuticals, there's two directional statements that are being explored at high speed.
And I'll just add to that, Yogi, that DeepMind, through their AlphaFold initiative, they released the protein folding instructions that they generated through AI for 200 million proteins. And they made that open source. And so only within the last year and a half has that information been unleashed to the research community. And I think we're going to see, and we're already seeing, an explosion of results from that research. And then the other area, Perry, in terms of generative AI and medicine, I saw a report within the last couple of weeks, some research that was done using these large language models to respond to patients on their medical inquiries. And the patients in this study were actually more satisfied with the response that they were getting from this large language model than they were getting from actual physicians. They found the response to be more informative, more complete, more empathetic, etc. So I think that holds some tremendous promise for application within healthcare as well.
Well, we saw in the
Thank
survey
you.
that the one profession that over and over again in every region showed up as lowest in terms of confidence in the economy was education and research. And I put the two together because we often talk about research as if it's what goes on in the classroom. It's education and research. And the research area has been suffering in the last few years. There's been some pullbacks. And yet we're now seeing an open source tool called generative AI that is enabling enormous strides to be made. So the pressure that's been building may well finally explode in this boiler called generative AI that makes a significant contribution to opening up the professions, to challenging this monopoly of there's only one place to go for knowledge, and that was to the professions. It may open up enormous opportunities that have a significant bearing on the economy, warranting our students to be much more aware that there's change underway. So that's almost a wrap-up comment, but I'm not going to do the wrap-up. I'm going to ask each one of the panelists if they want to have any concluding comments today, and I'll start with whoever wants to nod their head first, meaning they're going to sleep. Okay, you smile, Trevor. You're going to go first. Any concluding comments you want to share?
I'll just reiterate what you have 2 slides down, that we have a provincial election on Monday, and regardless of, I just think it's really important that people educate themselves, understand the policies, look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and make an informed decision, but get out there and actually vote. It does make a difference. And so that would be my parting word.
Thank you. We got 17 votes here that might make the difference. Brad, do you want to bring any concluding comments?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the comment earlier that I try to remain unbiased or disinterested, but and I do, but I am wildly optimistic. I'm wildly optimistic about Alberta, about the industries we have, about the smart population, the engaged population that we have, and entrepreneurial. I think we've got all the, we've got the universities, we've got the institutions, we've got the incubator systems that are forming around capital, like was mentioned in the chat. We have, then you come out of COVID, which was forced us to innovate. It forced that things could be done with speed. We add on AI, it's going to eliminate boundaries and borders. It's going to continue to allow us to just do things quicker, better, faster, cheaper, and quicker. And all we need is leadership. And, if we could ever find someone in their, mid 40s, early 40s from Lethbridge that has political, experience plus economic development experience, I think we'd be well on our way. And that's my ending comment, Trevor.
Okay, it's up to you, John. I'll let you have the next to last word.
A lot of pressure coming after these two. Just on this machine intelligence, there's a company out of Calgary called Skymount Medical, and they're partnered with Louisiana State University using something called Deep Drug. They took 10 years of sampling and did it in 2 weeks. So there's just no question machine learning is going to absolutely revolutionize the research piece. And we need to find ways to jump on that. But adding on to Brad's comment, I was born and raised in Alberta. I'm a huge fan of Alberta and what we've done, and I think that we have the foundation to just absolutely dominate in terms of our maximizing our capabilities. And again, the call for leadership is huge. There's so many people that have extraordinary leadership. We just need to encourage them to get into the political arena as opposed to complaining about it. So back to voting and engaging. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time.
I think you've all articulated well what the KEI network itself, and that is those who responded to the survey as representative of this network of some 20,000 have been saying, and that is we need vision and we need management. Those were the two areas that they felt we were deficient in order to achieve objectives in innovation that were a primary contributor to diversification. Bottom line is we need vision that can simplify what is today incredibly complex, recognizing the regional differences, recognizing the rate of change, and recognizing the various needs and contributions of our industries, of our professions, and of our public services. But the one thing that stands out over and over is for government to get out of the way. The confidence that Brad expressed, the confidence that Barry expressed, and Peter and Todd and all of you, is that individual initiative can make an extraordinary difference. ChatGPT or generative AI has arrived maybe at the right time. Get on board or get out of the way. So I think that's my wrap-up message for what was an extraordinary series of episodes and a wonderful wrap-up seminar. So I thank all of you. Now get out and make a difference by voting. For those that are continuing interested in what we're up to, we've got 3 webinars forthcoming. Next week we'll be in Calgary doing something very different. We're having a get-together of those in the network who show up weekly and continue to be advisors. And Greg McGilvory and I have gotten together and are inviting you all in Calgary to Milestones at 4:00 on June 8th. The following week, Tommy Nilsson out of Prince Edward Island is a professor putting a book together on consciousness, and we'll have an interesting discussion about the relevance of consciousness and insights that we may or may not have, and where AI may or may not be going, and whether we should be fearful or otherwise. And then the wrap-up, Mark Milke from the Aristotle Institute, a new institute out of Calgary, will be having the last word this season on free expression. He has strong things to share, strong opinions, but I really look forward to hearing what Mark has to say. But I look forward to seeing all of you over the next 3 weeks again. So thank you. For those that don't return, enjoy the summer. We'll see you in the fall when we're doing 2 startup webinars on healthcare reform for reasons we've discussed today, and also on homelessness that we've had very little discussion about, a very complex issue. But I'd like to get some insights onto homelessness and what we might do to make a difference. So thank you all today. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Trevor in particular, and John for joining us again. Thank you, Claire, for helping administer this. So good night, everybody. Take care.